Okay. My sincere apologies, and I hope that it's okay that I take off my mask. It's just much easier for me to communicate without a mask. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. Today I'm going to be presenting work that's co-authored with two co-authors of mine, Alexander and Mike Rubin, who are at University of Connecticut. And the broader project we're calling Communities in Conflict in Mandate Palestine, Repression, Resistance, and Community Displacement. And what I'm really going to go through today with you guys for the next 40 minutes or so is kind of describing the project, kind of showing you the problems that we have with this project. I really want to be transparent about how we're thinking about this project. And then I'll show you a little bit of what we've been able to do. And then towards the end, I'll show you a little bit about the papers that we've written and the papers that we're writing and in the process of writing as well. So first of all, what are we trying to do? What is this project? We're looking to explain the dynamics of political conflict in Mandate Palestine at the village level and over time. And for us, the goal is really to create uniform quantitative data. And we want that to be a public resource for scholars of all sorts, whether they're quantitative or qualitative in their orientation, but we really want to provide a public resource that collects a systematic set of information from this period of Mandate Palestine and provides it for researchers to be able to use it, whether they're going to be doing deep dive into qualitative work or broad, large N kind of analysis, and to be able to bring this contentious period into a uniform, or at least attempt to get towards a uniform understanding of this idea and the events and the characteristics that happened at the village level throughout this period in Mandate Palestine. And so what I'm going to show you today is walk you through the evidence that we've been collecting, right? We're going to be using archival, primary, secondary source materials, and I'm going to walk you through these 5 main sources that we've been able to create so far and turn into quantitative data, and then I'll talk a little bit more about that. But just to give you a heads up on what these sources are, right? So the first source that I'm going to be showing you today is a book called The Record of Leaders, Revolutionaries, and Volunteers for the Revolution. I'm going to be calling it the Lexicon, right? And this is a book that was compiled throughout the 1960s and early 1970s by Palestinian scholars who went and interviewed people to look at the stories of their participation during the 1936-1939 revolt in Mandate Palestine. Right? And what we did is we collected all of these over 4,000 observations of individuals in this record, right, in this lexicon, and we were able to automate the entire collection of this book and attach to each one of these individuals the village which the authors ascribe them to and their level of participation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The second source that we're going to be talking and looking at today is what's known as the Village Files, which is an assorted set of surveys collected by the Haganah, the pre-state Israeli intelligence forces of the Haganah, the paramilitary, and how they did a survey in the 1940s of over 550 Palestinian villages, and each of these surveys follows a systematic set of questions, of 36 questions, to which they responded to using informants and scouts to be able to respond to these answers. And so this, as well as a source that we were able to turn into tabular data. And then on top of that, we added British administrative records, so the survey and the census of Palestine from 1931 to 1945. We've also been able to collect incidents of British repression throughout the revolt, throughout the 36-39 revolt. This was initially collected by a dissertation written in Hebrew by a man named Shafri, and he systematically collected from the British archives incidents of British repression throughout the 36-39, and we were able to attach that to our data set as well of incidents during the revolt. And then the last component is that we took all of the information provided in the Atlas of Palestine by Khalidi and accompanied by the Benny Morris sources, and look at what happened to each one of these villages in the 1948 war. And so what we're really trying to do in this project is to take primary and secondary source materials and translate them into tabular data, right? So that we can do these large sample comparisons and provide some kind of quantitative analysis, multivariate analysis of that variety for those who it is their preference. right? But the key insight that I want you to understand here is what we're trying to do is we're collecting information at the village level in this period of time. And we're trying to attach to each one of these villages, right, the set of events and incidences that we're able to collect, as long as we rely on the source of information to be systematic in its attempt to cover the entirety or the set of villages that they proclaim to do. And so we have all sorts of caveats about this data that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in just a little bit. So why do this, right? And I assume that a lot of you here are not quantitative social scientists, and so you may be asking yourself this really important question. Why would you embark on this project? What's the point? What does this give us? What do we gain from doing this? And I think that that's a valid question, right? Like, I am a quantitative social scientist in my orientation, and so for me, that is the tool that I know how to use, but how is this tool going to be useful for you? And for me, I think that there's a lot of benefits of being able to do this kind of work, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the insights that we were able to glean in this, but broadly, I think that creating maps is super informative. It allows people access to a broad set of information, which we're able to do because each of these villages in our data set is geolocated, so it's very easy to produce maps out of them that give us some kind of distribution of where things are happening over this period of time. We also want to know what's happening broadly, right? What is happening across all of these sets of villages, and that's where statistics really come into play, and they can help us summarize what's happening. Where did it happen more? Where did it happen less? Where did people participate more in the revolt? Where did they participate less? Where was, what kind of social phenomenon were occurring throughout the 1940s in this period of time? Where were there more cleavages within villages? What did the ethnic makeup look like of villages? What were the clan sizes, right? All of these questions we can glean from this data, and one of our main goals is within the next year to produce a public-facing website that's going to include all of this information with an interface so that everybody can go and access this set of information and produce their own maps, produce their own statistics, so it becomes much more available for everybody to do this kind of thing. And again, one of the advantages of looking at this entire set of questions through the lens of a specific village, right, as our unit of analysis, is that it allows us to aggregate up. And so if you want to look at villages, great. But what if you're interested in a sub-district? What if you just care about Tiberias or Nablus or Safed? What if that's all you care about? Then good. I can aggregate up or down for you all of this information so that it makes it more accessible in different ways depending on what the question is that you're looking to ask. And so on top of all of that, for those who are more quantitatively oriented, we can also look at this data and assess quantitative and qualitative patterns and trends that exist within this conflict process, and looking at outcomes, right? And so for those of you who are so inclined, we can do these large N comparisons of nearly a full sample of the villages. I'll explain a little bit about our sample in just a moment. And again, we can do all sorts of multivariate frameworks, right? Statistical frameworks. But again, we're trying to think of this project as a complementary way for people to approach the questions that they have about this period through whatever lens that they want. And so if you're going to be doing deep process tracing or any kind of historical process, and you want to look specifically at one set of villages, then you can do that and complement it with what's happening broadly in the district or broadly in Mandate Palestine over that period of time. And so what am I going to be talking about today? Broadly, I have 3 sections that I'm going to be talking about. First, I'm going to be talking about what it is that we're doing in the first place. What is this historical data? Why am I thinking about this quantitatively in the first place? And I'm going to really problematize it for you. And for me, right, we're running into a lot of questions and approaches, and we're trying to figure out how to do this in the best and most efficient fashion, but also to bring it to become a product as soon as we can. Right? And so we have a lot of questions that we're going through, and we're going to introduce a bit of the problems and how we're thinking about it and the ethical considerations with the sources that we're using as well. And then I'll show you a little bit of the data. I'll show you a little bit of what we're able to do. I'll show you some maps, some new maps that we haven't been able to show up until now to almost anybody, which we think are probably new maps using these primary and secondary source materials. And so I'll walk you through the process of what we did, how we took the lexicon and the village files and turned them into quantitative data, and what that's able to produce in terms of the maps and the summaries and the statistics of it. And then towards the end, I'll show you a little bit about the questions that we've been able to ask so far, and kind of open up the floor and provide you with the information to ask the questions that you want to ask with this set of data. So here's how we're thinking about it. Because me and my co-authors are all quantitative social scientists, we're thinking about everything in terms of data. But of course, historians and social scientists broadly think of the information that they have as data. So how do we take this data, this source of administrative statistics or events that are recorded or even oral histories, and take them from data in their raw form and transform them into something that is quantitative, that is numerical, right? And for us, each one of these is a set of information as long as it meets a certain threshold that we think is necessary, right? And so the way that we're going to do this and the way that we're thinking about this as statisticians is really that the data that we collect has to be systematic in its orientation, right? It has to be systematic, it has to be encompassing of a broad sample. And we're going to talk a little bit about the biases that exist within our data in just a moment, but the thought process that we have about this is that we're taking a systematic application, right, of rules to transform this information in a transparent way. And in the website, we're going to show this process of how we went from the source material to the quantitative data at each one of the steps, and what the rules that we created were, so that if people say that rule was not good, that we can at least change it and tweak it so that in the next iteration of the data will improve every time. We don't proclaim to be perfect in the first go, but we think that by making this public and allowing people to comment and improve on it, that'll push us towards a better and constant improvement of it, as long as we have systematic rules that allow us to take this text, in most cases, and using advances in text as data and natural language processing, we're able to transform this text into quantitative data. So how are we thinking about doing this process? One of the main reasons that I wanted to show you the sources that we're using in the first place is because the approach that we're taking is to take all of the accounts into account. We don't want to just use one lens or one view. We don't want to just think about this through the lens of Israeli history and the narratives that are formed as a result of that, or through Palestinian history, or through the British history, right? What we want to do is to be able to triangulate each one of these sources so that we have some set of authoritative information that is complementary between these three different sources. Now, of course, that's a hard process, that's not easy to do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems in just a moment, right? But each one of these sources has their own set of problems. Whether you're talking about like a history from above style, from like a British administrative set of information, or from a history from below perspective, right? Each one of these has a set of problems and biases that exist as a result of that. But what I'm going to show you in just a moment is that despite these vast differences in the sources, right, the events that we are recording, the type of information that we're trying to record, actually shows a lot of complementarities between these three very, very different sources. So how are we doing this? We're trying to collect data that is comprehensive in its orientation, right? Attempts that were made by either administrative data, the pre-state Israeli sources, or the Palestinian sources that proclaim to be comprehensive in their sampling of all the villages, or at least the vast majority of villages in Mandate Palestine, right? And so what we're going to do in this process is triangulate this set of information, right? We're going to make the process transparent so that people can question and doubt whether we're doing it right. And we're going to automate this process so that if we did something wrong, we can iterate it again without having to go back and hand code each one of these iterations to do it better. And then once we have these different sets of information about the same event, right, we can start to triangulate and diagnose the discrepancies in this data to allow us to kind of have this conversation of where those discrepancies are coming from and what the biases in our data are. So here's the problem, right? As all of you know, sources are not neutral. There's nothing neutral about the Israeli paramilitary forces collecting information about Palestinian villages in the 1940s. They're doing it for a very specific reason. There's nothing neutral about Palestinians collecting oral histories of participation in the 36-39 revolt. They're doing it for a very specific reason. And there's nothing neutral about the British collecting administrative information. Each one of them collects this for their own purposes, right? And so we're really keeping that in mind and trying to think about this as statisticians in terms of what this could lead to, right? And so the set of biases that may be induced as a result of this collection process is super consequential for us, right? We're thinking about that really hard because we know that if our data are biased, any inferences that we're going to make are going to be biased themselves. And so we have to think really hard about the data collection process to make sure that our inferences are going to be valid. And what I'm going to show you in just a little bit is that, at least at a gut check level, I think that we're onto something here in terms of what we're showing and finding with the data. So how are we thinking about biases? There's a slew of biases that exist within this process, right? The selection bias, which means data that when it is collected is not representative of the population that we're trying to target, right? So if we're going to collect data that has information about a set of villages collected by the Israeli Haganah sources, but they're focusing only on villages that have a high proclivity to be contentious and to rebel, then that's not going to help us, right? What we need is all of the villages, including those who are more rebellious and less rebellious from the Israeli pre-state standpoint, right? And so that's really important for us to get at, and that's why the Haganah village files are a really good source of information, because they are not doing that. And we have even the data to show when we compare between the census of Palestine and the information that we've collected from the Haganah village files. And as we know, archival data is in and of itself not a neutral source of information, right? Archives are sites of power and inequality in many ways. What sits inside the archive is selected and put there intentionally, right? And so we have to be really cautious with which documents are entering into our system and how we're thinking about that. And that's the reason why we selected these 5 documents as our starting point, because again, each one of them proclaims to be, at least in their intention, to be comprehensive rather than selective in what enters into the collection process. So I'll start and take a look and think through the Haganah village files, right, which I'm going to be talking a lot more about in just a moment. When we look at these files, right, why were they collected? The Haganah, the pre-state Israeli paramilitary forces formed an intelligence services, the Shai, in the early 1940s, because after the revolt of 36-39, the Yeshuv started to prepare for contentious events that would occur. They foresaw it. And so what they were looking for is to collect information specifically on adversarial villages. But the way that they went about it is why these village files make them so unique and important to us, right? So even though they were collected from an adversarial standpoint, right, they were designed not to build up or allow us to study Palestinian society at all. They were designed, as Alon Jawad says here in the source, they were designed probably for the intention of destroying Palestinian society. But nevertheless, right, this is a source of information that is collected contemporaneously, that gives us information collected at the source, with the problems included in it. And as Jawad says, it has become over time a historical source for the study of economic and social Palestinian history because of the problems of the lack of written documentation from this period of time within Palestinian society, at least to the best of my knowledge in terms of the comprehensiveness of the type of documents that the village files provide. So, again, we're thinking about this. In many ways, we're problematizing it. We don't think that this is an easy question, and we really do want to stop and think really hard about how we're doing it and be as transparent as possible about the process that we're going about doing this, right? And so at each step of the way, we're thinking really hard about contextualizing the information, thinking about the sources, thinking about the intention for which these materials were collected, and how they relate to the information that we have in other sources. But, again, we think at least that using different sources of information, each with their advantages and disadvantages, each taking into consideration the biases that exist within them, and then allowing us to triangulate the differences and the discrepancies between these different sources can give us some new insights that we haven't been able to see so far. So let me walk you through the first process that we did. The lexicon of participants in the 3639 Revolt. This is what the book looks like. It's a register, it's a lexicon of participants with their names, their village in parentheses, and then a line or two about what their participation in the revolt looked like, right? And for us, what's really important to see about the structure of this document is that we can take this and use new methods in natural language processing to take this information and instead of hand coding each of these 4,500 participants in the revolt, we can automate this process. Because there are specific markers in how the book was written that allow us to attach the name of the individual to the village that they come from. So this individual came from southern Haifa, right? And we know that he was arrested and he became a prisoner. And so that information, those words, allows us to automate the process, collect and attach this individual to the village that we already have in our data set, right? And to record what occurred to this individual who was arrested. We can do this for each one of these individuals. We can look at the village that they came from. We can look at what happened to each one of these individuals. And then that allows us to count the number of people that participated based on this register of these 4,500 participants and map them to each one of the villages that we have in our data set. So this person was martyred, and that's recorded in the data set as that village had one person who was martyred. And then this person was the head of a faction, he was arrested, imprisoned. So we have categories of the forms of participation that each one of these individuals had, right? That we automated, collected, and then hand-coded a random subset of these events, right, of these records, and then compared to what we did in the automated process. And that allows us to aggregate up all of this information to the village level. And then, after we added all of that up and tacked that onto our data set, it allows us to produce this map. And this map is what we believe at least to be the first map of the participation in the revolt, right? And we have it on the left-hand side. In red, you have no participation based on the lexicon at least, right? And then in blue-green, we have participation, and then the size of the circle indicates the number of people in absolute terms who participated in the revolt at the village level. Now, not only that, because we have the administrative information as well from the British Survey of Palestine, we also know what the population of each village is. And so we can just talk about this in terms of absolute numbers, but we can also talk about participation rates, right? And so that gives us a different way of thinking about the same question when we're not thinking about the bias that will occur obviously in urban centers, right? And so there's obviously going to be an urban bias towards this participation because of the source. But when we're able to tack onto that the information about the village population, it gives us a much better understanding of what the rates of participation in the revolt were, and that gives us a better understanding of where the main sites of participation were, right? In a much more detailed way than what I've seen up until now. And so that's one example of how we're doing this process, how we use the lexicon to be able to translate the rates of participation and linking all of that up to our data set of 1,300 villages in Mandate Palestine. The next site that we look at is the Haganah village files, and so this is, again, the main source. This is what it looks like, and similar to the lexicon, the Haganah village files were collected systematically, answering 36 specific questions directed by the head of the intelligence services, right? And for those of you who don't know Hebrew, I also have an English translation here. We were able to translate roughly 300 of the 550 documents that we have into English, and then hand code the information that exists in each of these. So this is just the first couple of sets of information, but broadly, what do the village files include? The village files have a history of the village, a broad history of the village from its inception, when it was created, whether there's ruins, ancient wells, and then on top of that, they add questions about natural resources, what the water sources are, where they are, what the distance from the village is to the water sources, what land, how much of the land within the village is arable. They also have a set of questions on socio-political structures within the village, and so we have families and clans. We have the size of each clan within the village. We have the land ownership of the village as a whole, and each of the clans, Hamuna, by themselves. right? And whether the land is cultivated by the individual family, by the individuals, and whether it's mushar or mafuz, right? And so we really have a lot of information that is easily transferred into a quantitative set of information. We have the party affiliation of each of the hamulas. We have the leadership, muhtars, which muhtar is associated with each hamula, the local notables, the rivalries, the blood feuds, and so forth within the socio-political structures. We also have information about how many schools, how many mosques, how many teachers, the education levels of the teachers within the village, right? And then, of course, the pre-state Israelis collect information about what happened during the Arab Revolt in each village, and so they have information on the number of people who were killed, arrested, and hanged, right? And so here again, going back to that issue that I've talked about so often, the triangulation, right? This is one piece of information that the Israelis collected contemporaneously in the 1940s, 2 or 3 years after the revolt, right? And we can match this information to the information that we have from the oral histories, from the lexicon, and see whether they're compatible or not, to give us a good gut check on whether we're doing something that is right or wrong. And what do we find, right? And so when we look at these two different sources of information that were collected for very different reasons, that have a very different narrative at the base of them, but we're trying at least to be comprehensive in their attempts to collect information, right? What do we find? We have 130 villages for which we have complete information, and by that I mean non-zero rates of participation. That was for us the easiest test, because for some of these villages we don't have information, and we don't know if that 0 from the lexicon or the 0 from the village files is a true 0, or whether they just didn't collect information from that village. And so we wanted to look at the rates of participation for all the villages that had at least one participant in it. And what do we find? We find that in 75% of the cases, right, in 96 villages, the rate of participation that we find from the lexicon and from the village files are plus minus 5 participants. Now think about that for a second. Using two very different sources, we're able to triangulate and show that in 75% of the cases, the rate of participation is similar. It's only in 5-6 villages that we have a vastly different estimate of the number of participants in the revolt, right? And so that was for us a really good gut check that we're able to start triangulating this information and starting to find something that at least seems reasonable to us in terms of the discrepancies between the sets of information. So overall, what have we been able to collect so far? We have information based on primarily the Atlas of Palestine by Khalidi, on the records of over 1,300 villages in Mandate Palestine. Roughly 750 to 800 of them are actually sedentary and permanent villages, and a large proportion of them, roughly 450 of them, by our estimate, are either nomadic, Bedouin, or temporary locations. And so we have village files on over 550 villages, of which we've been able to hand code complete almost 400 villages with 35 variables, including all of the information that I told you earlier about the relationships between the clans, the political and party affiliations of each of the clans within the village, the land cultivation, which we're also able to double check against the British administrative sources, right? And each one of these villages has a unique ID that we're able to locate within a sub-district and geolocate, pinpoint the exact location of it to produce the maps that I showed you earlier. What else have we got? We took all of the British information that we were able to gather, right? The population, land, ethnic, national composition, and we even are able to calculate the distances between villages, both in aerial, and we have an overlay of the roads that existed at the time, so we can calculate the travel distance between villages at this period of time as well, for each of these villages in our data set. We collected all of the information in the village files, like I mentioned earlier. I don't really need to repeat all of this, but each one of these categories exists as a variable within our data set, right? Again, within the lexicon, we're able to count the number of participants, the form of participation, whether they were a leader, how many leaders existed within the village, how many people operated in a logistics capacity, and so forth, how many people were arrested, how many people were killed. And then on top of that, we also have the mapping of the British Repressive Acts at the village level, so we have information on in which village and when occurred house demolitions, special night squad raids and aerial attacks and so forth. And then on top of that, as I mentioned, all of the British administrative data. And so with all of this large data set that we've collected, what are the questions that we've started asking, right? And again, I want to emphasize that there's too much for us to really be able to handle here. There's so much information provided in this data set right now that we just started with the questions that were interesting to us, but we're really looking forward to start collaborating and working with other people to start asking other sets of questions that we're not even thinking about at this point with the data that we have. So the first paper that we wrote was looking at the question of social cohesion and forced displacement. And so what we did here is theoretically we were asking ourselves a question about whether social cohesion should matter in terms of what occurred during the 1948. And specifically what we're asking is whether villages that were more socially cohesive, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in the Q&A if you have questions on how we operationalize that and made that into a variable, but we thought that maybe villages that were more socially cohesive, that were more able to organize themselves, would be more likely to preemptively evacuate the village prior to the arrival of Israeli forces. And again, we're using here the information that is provided to us by the village files that gives us a lot of rich information about the social life within the village, right? And so we're looking at after we finished collecting all of the information in the village files, we created a coding of which villages had higher or lower levels of social cohesion, and we were looking to see whether that was associated and in certain circumstances even causes a higher likelihood of preemptively exiting the village prior to being violently displaced by the Israeli forces, right? And we collect that information through the Colloquium and Morris coding of what occurred to each one of the villages, and then we map all of that together. And what we find is that villages that had higher social cohesion, right, were more likely to preemptively exit, as we're calling it, because in the paper we're talking about what Palestinian villages are thinking and how they are actively trying to negate the operations that are happening to them and around them. And so just to show this again in a map form, right? So the way that we're thinking about it is that villages that were behind the Jordanian lines are not part of the sample in this specific set of questions. And then we're mapping here the three set of outcomes that occurred in each village, whether they preemptively evacuated, whether they did not evacuate at all, or whether they were, and I apologize for the term, but violently evacuated, right? Which is an oxymoron, but the way that we're writing it inside the paper, it makes a little bit more sense. Right? And so we're looking at this map here, and what seems to me to be a really interesting puzzle is that if you look at the Galilee region, right? You're looking at villages that are side by side right next to each other. And some of them were not expelled, were not evacuated at all at any point. And right next to them, there are villages that decided to leave prior to the arrival of the Israeli forces. And right next to them are villages that were violently displaced by the Israeli forces. And so what is driving this variation? And what we were trying to argue is that villages that were more socially cohesive would be able to organize preemptively and leave the village. And this is in fact what we find, right? And our finding is primarily in areas, in villages that had a higher population, right? And so villages that were larger than 150 or 200 were more likely to successfully exit if they had high levels of social cohesion, but this mattered much less in smaller villages of less than 100 here. The x-axis here is in terms of the percentage, the percentile of the population level. But what I'm trying to show you here is that villages that were large, but were socially cohesive, had a higher likelihood of preemptively exiting rather than waiting to be displaced or waiting to negotiate with the Israelis on their ability to stay behind. Our next paper is really going to be looking at the questions of the revolt and repression. And so here, we really don't have a well-formed paper yet, but our goal is to kind of look at the dynamic of repression and participation during the revolt. Our main data source here is again from the lexicon that I was showing you earlier. And it's been very challenging. It's taken us almost a year to complete the automation and the data collection process from the lexicon, but we're really close to being done, so we're going to start writing up the next paper. And the questions that we're trying to ask are like, what are the set of linkages between the issues of repression and dissent, and how did repression during the revolt affect outcomes during the 1948 war, right? And so because our data set is expansive and goes from 1936 all the way to 1948, we're able to look at the links between events that happened in the 1930s and how they are related to outcomes that occurred during the 1940s and during the 1948. And so the last thing that I'm going to show you for now is just a little bit of what we think is a gut check in terms of the data that we've collected. So we haven't, this is still exploratory. We just finished completing, we're in the process of completing the lexicon and adding that onto our data set. And so we were asking some basic questions about the information that we've collected. So one of the first things that we thought about is thinking about this link between repression and participation, whether villages that had higher levels, that had house demolitions occur in them, we should also see higher rates of participation. Now, I'm not making a claim one way or the other, but I'm going to say that it's likely that either there was high levels of participation, and as a result of that, the British went and demolished houses, or the other way around, as a result of demolishing houses, we should see higher rates of participation because of the backlash effect. And so what we see here when we're mapping, for those of you who are unfamiliar with box plots, right, what you're trying to look at here is just this big bold line here in the center. And what this really shows us is that the average rate of participation, so here on the x-axis, you have the proportion of the village who participated in the revolt based on the lexicon data, right? And whether there were any house demolitions. And here, at least, again, we find some idea that on average, right, there's higher rates of participation in villages that had a house demolition. So again, that gives us a good gut check that there's something that we're seeing in this data here that is complementary to each other because these are coming from different sources, right? The information that we have on the participation rates is coming from the lexicon, and the information on the house demolitions is coming from the Shikri data. Another question that we had, and again, this is probably trivial, but we looked at the political affiliations of the village, right? And the rate of participation in the revolt. And so we classified these into four main categories based on the distribution within the clans of the village. And so either they were affiliated with neither of the two main parties, or they were affiliated with the Shashibis. Either the clans were mixed in their political affiliation, or affiliated only with the Hussein. And here again, this is kind of like what you would expect to see. The rates of participation in villages that had at least some supporters of Hussein participated at a higher rate. Another thought, and going on this notion of social cohesion, we might expect villages that had more rivalry and blood feuds occurring within the village to see higher rates of participation, as we do see as well. Indicated by the higher mean of those villages that had blood feuds or rivalries, right? And then we also have findings that are like maybe opposite to what some people think, right? And so here what I have on the y-axis is the rate of participation that we were just looking at, and here is the logged amount of citrus or cultivable land in each village, right? And so here again, what we might expect is that villages that were wealthier had more to lose, and therefore would participate at lower rates, right? Or the opposite could be true, and villages that had more wealth in the form of Arab citrus were more likely to participate. But we really find like a flat line here. There's no real association between the wealth levels in the village and the rate of participation in the revolt. And another thing that I've seen people talk about is that the participation in the revolt had nothing to do with the ideology of the village, and it might just be a question of proximity, right? Maybe the closest villages to Jewish villages that had the most interactions, whether positive or negative, were the ones who were going to be more likely to participate in the revolt. And here again, we have kind of like a flat line in terms of the association between the minimum distance to the closest Jewish village and the rate of participation in the revolt. So by no means, I don't mean for these last graphs to be authoritative or determinative. There's still a lot of work to be done on our side, but I wanted to show you a little bit of what we're able to do with the data that we've collected in terms of the mapping, in terms of the showing of the data, in terms of making it accessible, And it was important for me to talk a little bit about the process that we're doing to be as transparent as possible, and we're hoping again in the next year to make all of this really accessible on a public website so that anybody can go in and either do their zoom in on the specific village and look at the information over time, whether it's participation in the Revolt or the village files information across the entire period of time, or look more broadly through a more quantitative approach and really make this an accessible tool for researchers depending on whatever lens they're coming from. So that's all I've got for today. I'll finish off with our new map that we're very excited about. And I really want to say thank you, and I really look forward to your questions. I know that this is probably